All right, let's start off here with verses 1 through 5. It says, Then David again gathered the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name, the very name of Yahweh of hosts, who's enthroned above the cherubim. And they drove the ark of God on a new cart, that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Uzzah and Aio, don't really know how to pronounce that, the sons of Abinadab, were leading the new cart. And so they brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, and Aio was walking ahead of the ark. And now David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before Yahweh with all kinds of instruments, man made of fir wood, and with lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. So really, as we just kind of get into this little bit of an introduction, these first 5 verses, and we kind of set the stage of what's to come, we're seeing that the whole chapter really is about the Ark of the Covenant and how they handled it. So kind of first things first, I want to step back and just remember and remind us of what the Ark of the Covenant was, right? Maybe in the most simple of terms, the Ark of the Covenant was essentially like a gold chest with a lid on it, and there was decorations of cherubim there built onto the lid. It had gold rings on the sides where the carrying poles would be slid through, and that will come into play in just a little bit. But notice what's also said in verse 2. The ark is called by the name of Yahweh of hosts, who is enthroned above the cherubim. So a lot of this is all symbolic language to talk about how God had appointed that this Ark of the Covenant be like a physical representation, a symbolic place of like his throne, of where he would sit in his presence amongst the people. It was a place where he designated where there would be at times the Shekinah glory would come down in like a flame of fire, and the Israelites would have like a glimpse of God with them in his actual presence. Maybe you can even remember all the way back to earlier parts of 1 Samuel, when we had started this, I guess, months ago now. The leaders of Israel ended up losing some reverence for this, sacred ark, and they were treating the Ark of the Covenant more like a lucky rabbit's foot, a good luck charm kind of a thing. And so when they went out to battle the Philistines, they said, I know what we'll do. We'll just bring the ark with us, and it will essentially grant us victory because we will have the ark here in our presence. Because of that lack of reverence, and they didn't actually seek the Lord as to whether they should have done that or not, the Philistines won, and they captured the ark. And they took their ark and put it into the house of their false gods, and as like a trophy. But while the ark was there, the Philistines slowly but surely were learning to revere that ark as the Israelites should have done, because God started plaguing the Philistines with like tumors and things like that, all these plagues. And so they just kind of sent the ark from city to city to city, and God just brought judgment wherever the ark went. And so they eventually had enough, and they said, we got to send this ark back to the Israelites. And so they sent it to the Israelites, and then once they got back to the Israelites, there still was a lack of reverence because they decided to look inside the ark. And then God judged them for doing what God had commanded them not to do. And it was 70 people got struck down for their disobedience and their irreverence. And so then they too were kind of like the Philistines, like, well, we don't want the ark here. Goodness gracious, like, what do we do with all this? And so they sent the ark off to a man named Abinadab. And there it sat at Abinadab's house for the past 20 years. And that's kind of brings us to where we're at right here. And it's kind of maybe worth, God bless you, noting that the entire time the ark was there in the house of Abinadab, King Saul or nobody really seemed to seek out the ark. No one seemed to have a concern for it to bring the ark back to the tabernacle where it belonged. Kind of like the out of sight, out of mind kind of a thing, where there should have been a passion, there should have been a zeal to properly worship God through it. And so, if we were to cross-reference this portion of 2 Samuel here to 1 Chronicles chapter 13, and unfortunately I was playing a little bit of catch-up this week, and I do not have any slides for you. So if you're a slide lover and you like the references, can't expect them tonight. But there records a little bit of extra details of like what we have going on here in verse 1. So 1 Chronicles 13:3, if you want to jot it down, 1 Chronicles 13:3, David says, let us bring back the ark of our God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul. which is the LSB version. And then I like also the paraphrase-ish version of the New Living Translation that said, "It is time to bring the ark of our God, for we neglected it during the reign of Saul." And so David is saying how there was like this, misappropriation in their heart and in their view towards the ark. That really the whole entire nation was guilty of this. And David wants to honor God by getting the ark and bringing it back to their new headquarters there in Jerusalem and seeking the Lord and worshiping him with having the Ark of the Covenant. So that's his attempt here in chapter 6. And it's not just like a political event now that he's been, anointed king and, he's won a few victories. And so this is just the right political move to do. I think that it's deeper than that. This is David having a heart to honor God rightly. And it's like a long overdue spiritual restoration of bringing the ark to the right spot. And so what we're going to see, though, is even though he has the right desire, the right idea, he doesn't go about it in the right way. And that's kind of maybe a big idea and a big theme of we need to worship God in the way that he's prescribed, not in the way that we want. So notice verse 3 tells us that they placed the ark on a new cart. That's worthy of pausing right there because it's already a red flag. They put it on a new cart. Why would they put it on a cart is a good question you might want to ask ourselves. Well, essentially, they were just not really thinking through and doing enough research, and they just resorted back to how the Philistines moved the ark last. The Philistines put it on an ark, and they didn't know God's law on the right way to move it because they were trying to respect God by kind of getting the ark back to where it belonged because they were tired of all the plagues and the tumors and whatnot. So in their mind, they said, well, we'll just put this ark on a cart, and they hooked up, 2 mother cows to it who had like their calves waiting, for them to feed. And the Bible said that these cows had never been hooked up to a yoke before. So it was like all the odds were stacked against these cows from actually taking the ark on this cart back to Israel. And sure enough, they just load straight to the Israelites, And so it was God supernaturally working and getting the ark back to where it needed to be. And so, to some degree, maybe the Philistines saw and the Israelites saw that it worked. It, quote unquote, it worked. The ark went from one spot to another spot, and maybe they're just trying to copy that in a sense. It's like, hey, it worked for them, maybe it'll work for us. But just because it worked for them doesn't make it acceptable for God's people to do it in a method which God did not prescribe. Maybe they're even trying to honor the Lord here because as they put it on a new cart, right? Maybe they saw it like, oh yeah, here's the old cart that the Philistines once had it on. Well, let's get it off of that cart. Let's put it onto a new cart and we'll honor the Lord this way. Well, even then, maybe it's the best of intentions. It's still not what God had prescribed. They should have followed what God said in the book of Numbers, chapter 4. If you were to read through that, there's a few verses there in Numbers where God has designated that only certain priests were allowed to transport the ark. And it wasn't just any priest that could do it. You had to be from a certain family of the priests. You had to be from the family of Kohath. You had to be a Kohathite. And then even as the family of Kohathite, you couldn't just transport it any way you wanted. You had to transport it using the poles. You couldn't touch the ark even though you were, a priest, an Israelite, a Levite of that nature. It just didn't work that way. And so they had all these regulations. That's what they should have done. And so what we're going to see getting to the next verses is even though it was a good and grand idea, the failure we're about to see is mainly just because of a lack of obedience and to many respects, a lack of reverence, especially if you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, or you're just wanting to do it your way. A lot of that goes into a lack of reverence. So that's what we're going to see going into verse 6. So let's pick it up here, verse 6 down to verse 11, where it says, "Then they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, and Uzzah reached out toward the ark of God and took hold of it because the oxen nearly upset it. And the anger of Yahweh burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down there for his irreverence. And he died there by the ark of God. And David became angry because of Yahweh's breaking out against Uzzah. And that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. So David was afraid of Yahweh that day, and he said, 'How can the ark of Yahweh come to me?' And David was unwilling to move the ark of Yahweh into the city of David with him. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Thus the ark of Yahweh remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and Yahweh blessed Obed-Edom and all his household." And so at first glance, this seems like it should have been a pretty straightforward journey. Geographically, it's only 8 miles away from Jerusalem. So this is a distance that could have easily been covered in like less than a full day, really, even with a large procession of people. So in other words, we need to see this as not like some really difficult cross-country move. And the reason this was so difficult was because of like the great distance and all the potential dangers here. No, the difficulty and the failure had nothing to do with distance. It has something to do with disobedience. That's really where we're getting at. Because of their disobedience to transport the ark correctly, that even led to another situation where Uzzah kind of, in a sense, got set up, and then he reacted in a way with another act of disobedience. So one disobedience just led to another. In verse 6, we read how the oxen began to stumble as they're traveling, and then it looked like the ark was going to like maybe tip off and fall off the cart, and it makes sense, probably even by impulse. Uzzah's like, oh no, I don't want it to hit the dirt. Let me just stabilize it really quick, is probably what was going on through his head, wanting to protect it. And he touches it, he stabilizes it. From a human perspective, I would think that's reasonable. But even this heartfelt, what seems like a good idea, it's not a good idea because verse 7 talks about his action resulted in the anger of the Lord was burning against him. So it's not just enough for our motivation to seem right. God struck him down dead right there on the spot. And I know a lot of people, you might read through this and go, I just don't get it. Like, he's trying to honor the Lord in a sense. He's trying to protect the ark. It just maybe feels a little bit harsh for God to do this. And I would just want to encourage us and lovingly remind us that we need to always submit our understanding to the holiness of God. Like, I can't always fully wrap my mind around why God would act in certain ways. And if I ever come to a point where I'm like, oh, Lord, that just seems too harsh, God has a perfect level of justice that is going to supersede our understanding. There are going to be certain elements of God that we can never fully, truly figure out. So we have to always submit our understanding to the perfect holiness and justice of God. And this part accounts for it. Because at the end of the day, even though he was trying to maybe in his mind do the right thing, he was disobeying and sinning against the commands that God had established and set up for them to follow. You could write this cross-reference down, Numbers 4:15. The instructions are crystal clear. It says, they must not touch the holy objects or they will die. I mean, it's like, I feel like God's pretty just, right? If he said what would even happen, then, they could have had a greater respect to just say, God, you'll figure this out. If you said don't touch it and it falls, then I can just hand that over to you. I can let my understanding go to that. So I do believe Uzzah was likely acting in ignorance and innocence here. But know here that we don't ever want to use that as an excuse to whether it's innocence or it's ignorance. Like, disobedience to the Lord will still have consequences. So many times God is merciful and maybe we don't notice the consequence, but sincerity alone didn't change the fact that he was in disobedience, and this was an important enough type of disobedience that God was wanting to set a certain standard to show how important this was for him to be revered and to be held holy. I think there's a very similar correlation to this into the book of Acts, when you have, who was it, Ananias and Sapphira, who came and they lied about how much they sold their property for. And, they didn't have to sell it and give it away. And even if they did, they didn't have to, give any specific amount. So whatever they wanted to give would have been fine. But then they lied about how much they gave. And in that early establishment of the church and the authority of the apostles and how that church was to act, there was something in God's perfect justice to show, I need to set a precedence here for my church. And God just struck them down dead right there for lying directly to the Holy Spirit, is how the text puts it. So that's God's justice. It's perfect. I have to submit to that. And even maybe they, quote unquote, had good intentions to donate some of the proceeds to the mission of the church. There was still some fleshly desire in them to want to present themselves in a less than honest way, right? And so there were consequences for their obedience. And so here in this moment, maybe even having zeal for God's throne, I would just encourage us all, have zeal for whatever, the things of God that you're passionate about, and just having zeal for God in general. But the Bible teaches us that whatever zeal we have still has to be anchored in truth. I mean, think of like a lot of the other religions of the world today. A lot of them have a lot of zeal, but it's misguided zeal, and it could be horribly evil. So zeal sounds good, but zeal only grounded in truth is what is truly, truly good. I think of this cross-reference here, Romans 10, chapter 2. It's possible to be zealous for God, but not on the basis of knowledge. It's the Berean Study Bible version of that verse. We can be zealous for God, but not on the basis of knowledge, Romans 10:2. So that was an admonishment even directly to the Israelites, which in some way, shape, or form could talk about this event. It probably has a lot to talk about, too, of the Israelites wandering around through the wilderness and just being stubborn to a lot of God's promises. But it's a warning that could happen to anybody. There could be times in our life when we're wanting to serve God, we want to be worshiping God, but we end up doing it more so just based on what feels right to us and not necessarily what God has prescribed serving and worshiping Him actually is. Remember, God doesn't care just only about whether or not we're worshiping Him. He does care about that. But I think what maybe is even more important than the fact that He cares that we're worshiping Him, He cares about how we are worshiping Him. That is in the way that He has prescribed. I think of a really good cross-reference, in my opinion, is John 4, verse 23. The second half of it says, "True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be His worshipers." And we live in a time and a day and age where there is so much that maybe is just called worship, but in all really it's just more driven by our emotion or the way we like to be entertained or what actually satisfies us or just our personal preferences, rather than maybe what the Bible describes what worship and service to Him is really supposed to be like. So He says to worship Him in spirit and truth. It's not either or, it's both. To where, yes, there is a really key, important element to when we worship God, we worship in spirit, and we do so in like the matters of our heart, and whether that's just emotion or that's just with the spiritual side of who we are that's disconnected from like physical acts. But also the outer expression of truth is just as important. They go hand in hand. And so as we look at maybe an example like Uzzah here, and he had the best of intentions, it's always good, just not a sense of condemnation, to ask ourselves in humility, are we drawing near to God on His terms, or are we simply trying to make things work and we go about the Christian life in a way that we just think it should and it sounds right to us? I think that it's probably less common in a room like this tonight, but I have heard even extremes of this, to where you ask someone if they believe in God and if they're a Christian, and they say, oh yes, this, that, or the other, and their default position towards religion and Christianity and God literally comes out of the mouth, God and I have our own thing. We have like our own understanding, and I am very spiritual and I do appreciate the Bible, but then basically they talk about how they are really interpreting it however seems best and most convenient for them, and they create what God should be like in their own mind, and that's how they worship. But if that's not how God has revealed Himself, we don't get to like twist this to make it sound like what just is most convenient for us. That we got to be far, far away from that kind of passion and zeal and worship, because God would say that that technically is not worship at that point, and there could be consequences to that type of irreverence towards Him, because that's what the Scripture says happened to Uzzah. It was an irreverence towards Him. And so David and the people, they're full of this energy and emotion. They're worshiping with music, instruments, loud rejoicing, and none of that is a bad thing. Like, those can be so, so good, and I would encourage us to pray about how to incorporate those things into our life. But emotion is never a substitute for obedience, right? Emotion is never a substitute for obedience. And I give you another cross-reference that I think fits really, really well with this. Is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 28 and 29. It says, "Let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire." And it just goes to show you, like, there's other parts of Hebrews that encourage us. We get to come before God boldly, right? But, I mean, this is another reminder by the same author in the same book, in the same context, that as boldly as God calls us to come, there's still an element where we have to come in humility. We need to have a reverence with the way we approach Him, doing it on God's terms. So just going back to Uzzah here, he's not even trying to mock God. He's trying to help. but he helped in a way where God had forbidden him. And so just maybe another reminder, I think another good cross-reference to just how we conduct maybe all of our life. Proverbs 14:12. It warns us, there is a way which seems right to a man. Uzzah thought this seems right, but its end is the way of death. And for him, it was quite literally the way of death. And for us, that might just mean more metaphorically, where it's leading to a lot of discipline and disappointment and correction. And it's just so applicable today. There are going to be so many things, whether it's in our life or in our ministry or whatever, that seem right to us, and our hearts get stirred up a certain way, and our emotions seem sincere. But we have to make sure that however we feel and our philosophy has to line up with this. We have to be reading it, we have to be studying it, and compare what we call truth and worship to God's word. Because no matter how much sincerity we have, it will never sanctify disobedience. God will hold us accountable to this, whether we know it or not. He's going to hold us accountable to this. So after the consequences of Uzzah's disobedience, we're told that David was looking around, and in verse 8, that David was getting angry at this. I don't believe that David was angry at God. The text doesn't say so specifically, so I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. I don't even think that David was angry at Uzzah in particular. From the context, it seemed like David was fearful towards God, unsure of what's going on, and probably had a little bit of right feeling to be scared about what might happen. And I think his anger was geared towards himself. Right? He's looking at the situation, and this entire tragedy was ultimately a result of David's own carelessness and his poor leadership and his ignorance. He just didn't know what was going on. Like, I was just trying to bring the ark back, and I guess I'm not doing the right way, and now all of a sudden, someone's dead, and that we went from rejoicing to mourning, and the whole attitude of the whole event just shifted hard. And I think David had this anger, and I think it was mainly geared towards himself. The right heart in wanting to bring the ark back, but he didn't slow down long enough to go, well, you know what, as I bring the ark back, maybe I should inquire of the Lord. Lord, how should I bring it back? He could have searched the scriptures. How does God say to do this? And he would have found the answer. And he eventually kind of asks this question, right? If you looked at verse 9, David says, how can the ark of Yahweh come to me? I think that's more than just a literal question. That would have been a literal question before the trip. Hey, how can the ark come to me? And then let me search the scriptures. Oh, this is how the ark can come to me. Hey, where are the Kohathites? Come over here. Grab these poles. Let's go, But that's not what he did. So here, when he says, hey, how can the ark come to me? I think this is more of a rhetorical question. I think it's more of an emotional cry. I think what we're hearing here is the voice of guilt, maybe a lot of the voice of despair that's coming out of David in this moment, just overwhelmed by what had happened. And I believe he's wrestling on the inside in his heart. He's talking to himself in a sense of should I even try this again? What if someone else dies? Is God angry at me? Maybe this will never come to Jerusalem. And he's just sitting there confused and in despair. So in that confusion, it turns into a lot of caution. And we read David just kind of puts the whole thing on pause for a moment. He's like, okay, we're not going any further. If anything, we're just going to leave this ark at the house of a man named Obed-Edom. Obed-Edom gets it. And this could just seem like a boring fact, but it's actually really neat if we pause and research Obed-Edom just a little bit. There's some interesting way we see God's providence and his sovereignty even over this situation of it going to this particular man. A literal translation of his name in Hebrew means the servant of Edom. And then there's these parallel accounts in 1 Chronicles, you read about what's happening here in 1 Chronicles, and it gives a list of this guy. And we read that Obed-Edom is actually a Levite, ironically enough. And that's significant because remember, the Ark of the Covenant was to only be managed and tended by the Levites. So whether or not he was the right guy to carry it, he is the right guy to watch over it. So David may not have been fully confident on what to do next, but God's providence is at work, and God makes the ark go to where it should have been, at least in the time being, and to regroup and to rethink, how do I move this? And it being at a Levite's house, they will soon get some more Levites there and transfer it the right way. We're told in verse 11 that Yahweh blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belonged to him. So God is now blessing it and sanctioning it and said, okay, at least now it's in the hands of the Levites and these guys are doing it right. And that is going to be a key bit of information of what plays into what we read next when David's going to hear about God blessing the house of Obed-Edom And it's a beautiful thing where David then gets clarity on how to properly move forward from his mistake of like disobedience and the nation's irreverence through this. Again, if I could just cross-reference 1 Chronicles, if you're a note taker, 1 Chronicles 15:13. David realizes, he says, Yahweh our God broke out against us, and now he has the answer, because we did not seek him according to the ordinance. So he's like, oh, there's a right way to do this. He actually literally prescribed and told us already what we ought to do. So he's openly confessing that the problem here is he's under full realization was his own disobedience. His own poor leadership is what happened here. God judged them because they moved the ark outside of God's prescription. And so this is really him repenting, and he's feeling a refreshed sense of confidence. And through this repentance, through this new sense of confidence, in this next section that we're going to read, they presume the procession, and they're going to, in the right way and in a lot of renewed joy, make it there to Jerusalem. So this next section, let's just read verses 12 to 15, where it says, Then it was told to King David, saying, Yahweh has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. So it happened that when those who were carrying the ark of Yahweh had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. And David danced before Yahweh with all of his strength, and David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of Yahweh with shouting and the sound of a trumpet. So verse 12, this is the encouraging news of, hey, God has just been pouring out blessing on the house of Obed-Edom. And that news does something in David's heart, gives him all this hope. So he realizes, hey, God's not against us. God is for us. And he's not angry at us and striking us down just for the sake of anger. Like there's plan, there's purpose behind all of this. So he learned his lesson, and now he's ready to try again. And when we look at verse 13, this is what shows us that, yes, they are now doing it the right way. It's just the way that the verse is worded. It specifically mentions those who were carrying the ark. And so that is the clear indication that it's no longer on the cart anymore. They found the poles, and they got the right Levites, and now they're moving it the way that they should. I guess we, to some degree, have to assume that it's specifically the Kohathites that are there, that are mentioned in Numbers 4, like the right way to do it, because their names aren't in here. But I think David did. He went back and consulted the scriptures, and they're carrying it right, and they probably got the right guys carrying it, and God is just blessing them on their way over. So some of this is like the minor details may be presumed, but the clues are right there in it, that David had repented, and he's now walking in obedience to the Lord. So it's not just God's way. What we read him doing is even going like above and beyond doing it God's way. Because as he's carrying the ark, they're also stopping and sacrificing and worshiping, kind of like covering, maybe not covering their tracks, but just like showing this extra excitement, like, you know, God, we're going to do it your way, and then we're going to also worship you along the way while we do it. Notice verse 13, the very end of verse 13. It says that he sacrificed an ox and a fatling after 6 steps. So I will say there's a little bit of debate into what exactly this means. You can picture it in your mind almost however you want. Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but there's one camp of scholarships that say that every 6 steps they went, they set the ark down, and they sacrificed and worshiped. And then they would pick it up, go another 6 steps, set it down, and sacrifice and worship. The whole 8 miles or however long it took them to get there, right? That's a possibility. I mean, that would have made that one-day journey rather long. I don't know if you can still do that in a day. Perhaps you can. I don't really know. So then there's the other side of this thinking is that they were excited. They picked it up and they set off and they went 6 steps and they said, wait a minute, hold, just pause real quick. Set it back down. Let's have a really big burnt offering here. Let's praise the Lord and really set this tone off right. It's like when you're going to go on a trip. And my wife is so good at this. Hey, why don't you just stop and pray for our trip real quick? You know, like we're going to be on this freeway for hours and this, and that. Let's just pray before we go. It's like, okay, yeah, sure. I'm like, let's just pray. You know, I was just maybe just assuming God's going to bless our trip, but sure, it might be good to pray about it, right? And so that's probably what it is like, let's just go. And they went 6 steps and they said, wait, let's pray. Let's praise the Lord. So that could be the other option. And then after that, they picked up and they just walked the rest of the way there. So was it every 6 steps? Was it the first 6 steps? You do the one that you like best. Either way, the point is clear that the second attempt is drastically different than their first one. All right, this one is full of obedience. This one is full of deep reverence for God's commands. And so this time, God is being honored properly by David, by all the people. The entire journey is one of rejoicing. We see that near the end. David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of Yahweh with shouting and the sound of a trumpet. And so we see verse 14, David leading the way. He's dancing before the Lord, and the scripture says, with all of his strength. It's a glorious thing. Everyone's looking at this as a positive. Well, everyone, maybe except one person. In this next section that we're going to get into, his wife, Michal, she sees this in a slightly different way, right? David is out there in this unashamed devotion, and then she just looks at him and just kind of despises him for his actions. And we'll explain why. We'll talk about that why. So let's start at verse 16 and just go through the rest of the chapter. It says, then it happened as the ark of Yahweh came into the city of David, that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before Yahweh, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of Yahweh and placed it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before Yahweh. Then David completed offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, and he blessed the people in the name of Yahweh of hosts. And he apportioned to all the people, to all the multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread and one of the dates and one of the raisins to each one. Then all the people went to his own house. So great party, great celebration. Everybody's happy. Then now David even returns to his house in verse 20. But David returned to bless his household. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel has glorified himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids as one of the worthless ones shamelessly uncovers himself. So David said to Michal, it was before Yahweh who chose me above your father and above all his people to appoint me ruler over the people of Yahweh, over Israel. And so therefore I will celebrate before Yahweh. He's pointing out who he was addressing his attention towards. Verse 22, and I will be esteemed even more lightly than this, and will be humble in my own eyes, but with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be glorified. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. So we'll talk about that too. David here is out in public, dancing with all his strength before Yahweh, simply totally passionate and totally unashamed to give to God all that's in his heart. And I think as we look at this and everyone went back to their home happy, 99% of the people are rejoicing with him. But with verse 16, talk about Michal, his wife, just kind of staring out through the window. She's looking at him. And what we see clearly is her despising him. And I think also what we'll talk about, there's like a mixture of jealousy that's also in her heart. Instead of seeing love and worship, she sees him as undignified and embarrassing even. This is primarily expressed in verse 20. When David returns back home to his house and Michal greets him at the door, so to speak, and really we ought to be reading what she says back to him with hints of sarcasm. And that's how this is presented. Oh, how the king of Israel has glorified himself today. Like in her mind, it's the complete opposite of being dignified and glorying. She's mocking him, basically implying that it was beneath him as the king to act in such a way. That he was not doing his role justice to be presented before the people with that type of attitude and that type of visual expression, right? Basically, her view is that there's a lot of shame connected to the fact where if you look back to verse 14, it very specifically talked about not only is he dancing with all his might, he's wearing this linen ephod. Well, that means he would have had to take off his royal garments. And there's like linen ephods that are typically worn by priests, and then there's just like linen ephods that are kind of like an undergarment, so to speak. And so David is like just in many respects looking like one of the common people. He's not dressed to be their king and he's above them. He's like, hey, we're all on the same playing field before the one true king, Yahweh. And he's like, we are all going to worship together. He's identifying himself as a servant of God, not as a king lording over the people. And so in reality, it's a great act of humility. But from Michal's point of view, it's like humiliation. It's like, how could the king ever do that? You should comb your hair, put on your garments, put on your crown and all this stuff. That's her point of view. And she likely had this view based on how she was raised with King Saul as her dad. King David and King Saul had total different perspectives on life and worship and relationship with God. In King Saul's house, it was all about status and appearance. So in her view, the king just has to maintain a certain level of dignity and, poise and control, not dance around like a commoner in public. And so that's probably where she's coming from. Still an unhealthy view, a prejudice towards him and a judgment towards him where she should have had a humility. And, she didn't have the same kind of heart he did for the Lord. And so they were at odds. They were not equally yoked in that. And so it's not just her background, it's her pride. And so it's deeper than just how she was raised. It is a matter of her heart. But on top of all that, the text also suggests how there's some jealousy going on in her heart. Right, the ephod was a pretty close-fitting garment. In many respects, sometimes it was like two pieces, one on the front and one on the back, and maybe it would drape over the top. So it'd be open on the sides. You'd have a belt that kind of connected it together. And so someone could look at this and you could say he was running around half naked is a way to present it. That could be pretty accurate terminology. Some have suggested that he is running around naked, but that's not really what the text says. But they get that from verse 20. If you look at verse 20 again, her accusation is he uncovers himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids as one of the worthless ones uncovered themselves. And other translations, like the NASB, it says, for he exposed himself today in the sight of his female slaves. And so this idea of uncovering, exposing, people go, oh yeah, that means he was naked. It's no, he was not naked. So I don't know if you've ever heard that or thought that, but that has gone around a lot. Oh yeah, David danced before the Lord naked. No. He was covered. He was decent. It was way more revealing than maybe she wanted him to as the king and whatever her perspective was. But it was totally appropriate. So in other words, she's not just accusing David of acting in a shameful way that's not fit for a king. She's also accusing him of having maybe impure motives here, of acting maybe flirtatiously in front of the young women. Oh yeah, you just wanted to get their attention. So you got in your ephod, you got half naked, and all these women are looking at you now. And that was really your main motivation. You're just putting on a show. You want to impress the young women in the crowd. But verse 21, David answers her clearly and I think very firmly. He says, it was before Yahweh. He goes, I wasn't dancing before women. I wasn't dancing for the nation of Israel. I was dancing before my God. I wanted to worship him. All my attention, all my focus was on God. And I love the fact that this is where his care and his concern is at. He's not really worried about how other people are going to view him in this. He's like, this is what the expression of my heart was, and it was appropriate. And if other people aren't going to see it that way, well, then that's between them. And then he even reminds Michal, his wife, of a simple truth. And it may sound like a dig, but he's like, yeah, I was dancing before Yahweh. And it was Yahweh, it was the Lord our God who chose me even above your father. He kind of sticks it to her like that. And I don't think he's saying it out of arrogance. I think it's just to clarify, this is who my identity is. I am king because God has chosen me to be king. And God has chosen me to be king, and that's good enough. And I don't really care about what the people think. I don't care about what the young women think. I don't care if the nation approves of whether or not I'm dancing before God in a linen ephod or not. God's already chose me. I'm God's man and God's my God. And this is what actually matters to me, is that I'm just pleasing to the Father. And so he's just kind of, in a sense, correcting her on that too, that I'm not too worried and I'm not ashamed about public approval. And so the chapter closes with maybe this sobering detail of rebuke towards her. In verse 23, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. So again, there's a little bit of scholarly argument and debate on what's happening here. Some connect it to the fact of hey, you're going to see that I was in the right, because just before that he says, but with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be glorified. Other people are going to see how good this is, and I'm going to have other relationships with my other wives and my other concubines, and with you, I'm not going to anymore. And so some say the reason that she's childless to the day that she died is because David just stopped having any sort of marital relationship with her from then on, after this confrontation. And so that's a possibility. Text doesn't say that, but that could be a good answer. Others believe it was actually a divine judgment, where it's a form of discipline from the Lord, where because she was so harsh and critical and condemned him for his sincere worship towards God and leading the people in worship towards God, and she hounded him so bad from that God just worked and basically closed her womb. And that's the reason why she didn't have kids until the day of her death. So again, it's one of those things. I'm not going to be dogmatic. You choose the one that you like, and whatever fits the text and your theology a little bit better would be totally fine. Either way, I think this is a sober reminder for us to be aware, like, pride and jealousy are a big deal. Judgment towards other people is a big deal. There's scriptures we can look at Jesus reminding us to don't worry about the speck that's in someone else's eye when you got a huge log in your own eye. There are so many times in our life where we may miss out on a blessing, and we will heap a consequence on ourselves because we are putting ourselves and our convictions and our things into someone else's, and we see maybe what we think is sin in someone else's life, when God is telling us to worry about what's going on in our own life. And especially in a sense like this, where this speck you think you see or this log you think you see in someone else's eye is actually righteousness. It's one thing to be overcritical about real sin when God would still say, hey, I'm glad you're correcting the sin, but man, you got a lot of sin to work on. But then on top of when you have a lot of sin to work on and you're correcting someone for sin, when they're actually being righteous, it's like a different level of depravity. And so there's a warning here of that pride and on all of those things where we can miss out on blessings and be judged for it. So it's a warning. Let's not be hypocritical. Let's stay before the Lord in sincerity. And for lack of a better term, like, stay in our own lane, not be the Holy Spirit police. Like, we could be wise and discerning and step out in faith and lovingly, speak the truth in love when God's called us to do that. But in this situation, it's total judgment. It's a different situation. There's no justification here where I'm just living out biblical principles and holding my brothers and sisters accountable. I'm all for that, but I'm not for the judgment. I'm not for the self-righteousness and all of this kind of hypocrisy things that we've even been talking about on Sunday mornings as we go through Luke with the Pharisees. So just a loving, sober reminder that cannot be a part of the walk of the Christian. So that really brings this chapter to a close. I'll ask Caleb and the praise team to come on back up. But in closing, I want to go back for just a quick moment to verse 11, where it says how the ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. We didn't really talk about that. It was there for 3 months. And if we think about that, the entire journey back to Jerusalem, again, that should have taken just a day, right? It's only an 8-mile trek. But instead, it took 3 months, and it's not because this distance was so long, it's because their approach was so wrong. David wanted the right thing, but he was doing it in the wrong way. And it's very, very possible for us to go about our lives doing things for, wanting the right thing, but doing it in the wrong way. And I would just want to maybe encourage us to think about what's going on in our life, because what I see is like that was a delay. 1 day turned into 3 months. That's just a good way to describe it, as a delay. A divine appointed delay because they weren't doing it with the right heart. And for sometimes in our life, maybe there's delayed fruitfulness. Maybe there's delays in the calling that God has put in our life. There's delayed blessings that God wants to give us. Just a delay in seeing God move in however way. And sometimes it's not because we're like in sin and out there doing the wrong thing necessarily. Sometimes we just haven't taken the time to seek the Lord and then make sure we're clearly obeying God and doing it His way and not going about doing it in whichever way that we want to. I just thought just so clearly about how I see this in my own life in my pursuit of seminary. I can look back on this as I think it's such a good thing to want to pursue seminary, and I had all of these really good reasons of why I should go to seminary. And that was one of the biggest reasons of why I joined the Army. It's because I had other reasons of why I wanted to join the Army too, but I joined because I wanted to use the tuitions assistance and the GI Bill in order to pay for my master's degree. It's like, I'm going to get a master's of divinity, I'm going to get a master's of biblical counsel. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to go back to school and I'm going to get my master's degree. And so went down there, joined the Army, didn't work out, God sent me home. And then I didn't learn a lesson. I was like, I still want this master's degree, and that's why, one of the reasons why I tried to become a cop. And then I got hired on at Scottsdale PD, and I'm in the police academy, and they have a program where they will pay for so many credits of your tuition. yeah, like a lot at a time. It was like 2,000 per semester or something. It was crazy. I was like, great, this will be an awesome way to get my master's degree. And, in my mind, I'm justifying all these things, how it's for the church, it's for the ministry, and yada, 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 yada. Well, God ended up showing me that I had the right idea, but it was totally the wrong way to pursue it, right? And there's nothing wrong with the military. There's nothing wrong with the police. All those things, it's great. But what I saw, like in David in this chapter, I saw in me where David had to take a step back. David had to reassess a little bit. He had to get back to like, God, what have you said about this? And I need to get back to a spot of obedience. And then God blessed him with a plan to move forward. And it was a good plan to move forward. And so there was just so clear in my own heart where I saw that I was pursuing a good thing, but fighting a wrong battle, going the wrong direction. And God just I've never heard God's voice so clearly. Maybe not audibly, but it was like, he was saying, I've called you to pastor in a church. Like I have other men and women that will be really good godly influences in these other spheres. And I was like, I need to trust them that they're there. He doesn't need me there, but he's like, what I've called you to do is pastor a church, be back in full-time church ministry. And so I said, okay, Lord, if that's the way I'll do it. And as soon as I started pursuing that, the doors just started flying open for me to jump back into full-time ministry. And so I'm at a piece where I think maybe I have reassessed, and I think, hey, maybe sometime in my future, whether it's the very near future or if it's a distant future, I think seminary's still on the table. It would be neat to do it, I think it would be a blessing to the church to have that in my back pocket, so to speak. But I am only going to go forward when God gives me the green light. I'm not going to pursue these other doors with the best of ideas and then have to hit a brick wall again. And so just a loving encouragement to everybody here to think, are there other areas in our life where we're trying to do God's will, but we're just maybe stubbornly doing it in our own way? Right? Are there places where we've done things with the best of intentions, but we're not necessarily in submission to the way God has called us to do it? And the way God has called us to do it may be slightly different than He's called somebody else to do it. Could be the same end result, but a different path on how to get there, because we serve a personal, intimate God who's going to lead us on an individual basis. It will always line up with the Word, so it'll never contradict this, but the path still might look different the way on how God will lead us. And so we want to be sensitive to bringing our desires before the Lord and say, Lord, I'm not going to choose my way. I'm not going to choose their way. I'm going to choose your way.